My fiancée deceived my sick mother and got the house in her name. My brother called me screaming. Do you know what she did? When I first introduced Clara to my mother, Margaret, I thought it was one of those rare blessings in life where everything aligned. My mother had been sick for years, her lungs were fragile, and every winter was another gamble. Yet Clara walked into that hospital room with flowers, warm hands, and a voice that managed to cut through the metallic smell of disinfectant and the beeping of machines. She sat beside my mother's bed as though she had known her all her life. She told her stories, read to her, and even brought in homemade soup when hospital food became unbearable. I remember my brother, Julian, watching this unfold with suspicion. He never took to Clara the way I did. Where I saw compassion, Julian saw calculation. He would mutter things like, "People don't give this much without expecting something back." I brushed him off. Clara was my fiancée, the woman I intended to build a life with. I wasn't about to second-guess her kindness. During those months, my focus was split between preparing for the wedding and keeping my job steady. Clara took more and more responsibility at home. She handled the appointments, made sure my mother's prescriptions were filled, and coordinated with the nurse who came twice a week. My guilt for not being there more often was eased by knowing Clara had stepped into that role. It felt like teamwork, like what marriage was supposed to be. But then came the day Julian called me. His voice wasn't calm, wasn't collected. It was raw, strained, as if he had just stumbled into a burning building. "Daniel, do you know what she did?" His words struck through the static. I asked what he was talking about, but he didn't explain, not at first. He only demanded I come to the house immediately. I left work without telling anyone and drove across town with my chest tight and my hands numb against the steering wheel. When I pulled into the driveway of my mother's house, the one I grew up in, the place filled with every photograph and memory that still held my family together, Julian was pacing outside. He had a folder clutched in his hand, papers bent from his grip. The look in his eyes made my stomach turn. "She tricked Mom," he said, shoving the folder against my chest. "She made her sign the house over. It's in her name now. Clara owns it. Not us. Not Mom. Her." The words didn't land at first. They just circled around, waiting to cut. I opened the folder, scanning through pages stamped by a notary. There was my mother's shaky signature, the same signature I'd watched deteriorate over the years, barely more than a trembling scrawl. And next to it, clear and bold, was Clara's name. Owner. I remember standing in that driveway, trying to convince myself there had to be another explanation. Clara wasn't stupid. She wouldn't risk something this outrageous. There had to be a reason, some legal technicality. Maybe it was about taxes, or probate, or some protection for the future. Something rational. But Julian's face told me otherwise. "You really think she did this for Mom's sake?" he asked, his voice sharp, nearly breaking. "She's been planning this. I overheard her talking to one of her friends outside the pharmacy last week. She said the house would finally be hers soon." I didn't know what she meant until I found this. My chest felt hollow. I wanted to run, to demand answers from Clara immediately, but my mother was resting inside, too weak to be caught in the storm I was about to bring. Instead, Julian and I sat in silence for a long time, the folder between us like a weapon neither of us knew how to handle. When Clara finally arrived, she greeted us as though nothing was wrong. She kissed my cheek, asked if I had eaten, and carried a bag of groceries inside. Her calmness was unbearable. I followed her into the kitchen, the folder still in my hand. I asked her directly, no hesitation, what the documents meant. At first, she played innocent, saying it was just a precaution, something the lawyer suggested so that the house would be secure and the estate easier to manage. But the tone in Julian's voice cut through her act. "Stop lying, Clara," he said. "You convinced a sick woman to give up her home. Don't pretend this was for anyone but yourself." Clara's face changed in that moment. The mask of gentleness she always wore slipped. Her eyes hardened, her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a second, she didn't look like the woman I had asked to marry me. She looked like someone who had already won. "You don't understand," she said finally, her voice measured, almost rehearsed. "I've been the one taking care of everything while you two have been too busy. The house is safer with me. I'll make sure nothing happens to it." Her words didn't soothe me. They rattled around in my head, sounding more like ownership than protection. I thought of every late night she spent with my mother, every gentle touch, every smile. All of it had been part of a larger plan. The conversation ended with no resolution. Clara went upstairs to check on my mother, leaving Julian and me in the kitchen with nothing but our anger. I wanted to confront her further, to scream, but my mother's health was too fragile. The last thing she needed was to hear her sons tearing the house apart over legal papers she barely understood when she signed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the engagement ring on Clara's nightstand. The walls felt closer, the air heavier. The woman I trusted with my future had stolen my past. The next morning, Clara acted as though nothing had happened. She brewed coffee, packed lunch for me, and left notes about the florist appointments for the wedding. I watched her, my anger boiling under the surface, wondering how someone could live with such a lie so effortlessly. Later that week, Julian called me again. This time he wasn't just angry, he was broken. His voice cracked when he said, "She's talking about selling the place, Daniel. She's already asking around." The bottom dropped out of my world. The days following Julian's call were filled with a strange silence. Clara went about her routines as if nothing was wrong. She watered the plants, folded laundry, and answered calls in the other room with her usual bright tone. Yet behind that calm facade, I felt the walls shifting. I had seen the papers in her drawer, the agreements she had no reason to hide if her intentions were genuine. I stopped eating breakfast at the table with her. Instead, I sat in the living room with the television humming at a low volume while she pretended not to notice. That's when the distance between us began to feel like an open wound. She didn't even try to bridge it. She didn't ask me what was wrong, didn't probe why I seemed colder every morning. It was as if she already knew I had discovered her betrayal and decided to wait me out, convinced I wouldn't dare act. Julian wasn't so restrained. He called daily, sometimes just to remind me to keep my eyes open. "She's making moves, Daniel," he repeated. "You think she's slowing down, but people like her don't stop once they've tasted power." I hated how right he sounded. One Thursday evening, I arrived at the family house to check on Mom, only to find Clara already there. She was seated at the dining table with a man I didn't recognize. He wore a neat blazer, carried a leather folder, and spoke with the kind of smooth cadence that screamed salesmanship. Clara introduced him quickly as an advisor, then excused herself to fetch tea. He began asking me questions, not about my mother's health, not about the upcoming wedding, but about future property goals and long-term financial outlook. I sat rigidly in my chair, answering with clipped words until Clara returned. Only then did he close the folder and politely leave, though not without shaking Clara's hand with too much familiarity. As soon as the door shut, I asked who he was. She gave me a casual answer, claiming he was a financial planner helping her organize things. But the folder had the logo of a well-known real estate company. That was when I realized she wasn't just planning a sale. She was grooming the house for the market, step by step, under my nose. The next escalation came through the neighbors. Mrs. Alvarez, who lived across the street for nearly 30 years, pulled me aside one morning. She whispered that Clara had boasted during a walkabout soon having full freedom with the house. She had laughed about how the brothers would never understand until it was too late. Hearing that from someone outside the family made my stomach churn. This wasn't paranoia anymore. Clara was treating our home like her trophy. I confronted her that evening, but instead of panic, she responded with sharpness. "Do you have any idea how much this property is worth, Daniel? Do you think your mother's medical bills pay themselves? Do you think living in nostalgia keeps the roof over anyone's head?" Her tone wasn't defensive. It was accusatory, as if I were the one clinging to sentiment while she was being practical. Julian arrived halfway through that argument and didn't hold back. He slammed the brochures down in front of her, demanding she explain why her name appeared as sole owner. Clara didn't flinch. She declared it proudly. "Because I am the owner. Your mother trusted me. She signed the papers willingly." I felt sick at how natural the lie sounded. We decided enough was enough. Julian suggested we involve more people, to keep the confrontation from turning into a private battle she could spin later. That Saturday, we invited our cousin Helena along with Peter and Sophia, 2 lifelong family friends. Clara walked in expecting another quiet afternoon, but froze when she saw the group waiting at the dining table. Julian spread the documents across the surface like evidence. "Explain this to them," he demanded. Clara's act slipped quickly. She tried to frame it as something noble at first, claiming Margaret had been worried about complications and wanted her to simplify matters. But when Helena pressed harder, asking why then Clara had preliminary sale agreements in her drawer, the facade cracked. Her voice hardened. "Because the house is mine, and I will decide what happens to it." The room fell silent. Margaret coughed faintly upstairs, unaware of the storm below. My heart pounded as I realized Clara wasn't even ashamed anymore. She was triumphant. That was when Elena, her own cousin, spoke up. She had been hesitant to attend, but finally found her voice. She told me she'd sell the house and move with someone else. She said she'd finally be free once the money came in. Everyone's eyes snapped to Clara. Her face drained of color, then flushed red. She stood abruptly, knocking her chair against the wall, and stormed out. The silence she left behind was heavy. For the first time, no one doubted Julian anymore. The following week, the betrayal turned into open warfare. Julian discovered through a contact that Clara had scheduled an open house. Strangers would be walking through the property while our sick mother lay upstairs, her belongings still in the drawers, her breathing heavy in the halls. I confronted Clara late at night about it. She didn't bother to deny it. Instead, she told me coldly that it was her right, and that if I truly cared about my mother, I'd understand she was securing a future instead of clinging to the past. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ring I had once placed on her finger lay heavy in the drawer beside me. Every memory of her care for my mother replayed in my head like scenes in a film, except now I saw the motive behind each gesture. She hadn't been nurturing. She had been calculating. I thought of breaking off the engagement immediately, but Julian urged me to wait. Let her dig her own grave, he said. The more she shows her hand, the stronger we'll be when we strike. It was the hardest advice I'd ever followed. Living under the same roof with Clara, pretending we were still a couple while she schemed behind my back, felt like slow poisoning. Yet I stayed quiet, planning, waiting, watching. The day of the open house arrived. Clara dressed impeccably, greeting guests at the door as though she were the rightful hostess. She guided them through the living room, pointing out features like the hardwood floors and the spacious kitchen. Upstairs, my mother rested, unaware that her home was being paraded for strangers. Julian and I stood together in the hallway, fury simmering beneath our skin, watching people admire the home we grew up in while Clara smiled and gestured as though she had earned it. It was unbearable, but we didn't intervene yet. Not until we had the right audience. As the last group left, Clara closed the door and turned to us with a smirk. Now you see, she said. This is happening, whether you like it or not. But in that moment, she didn't know we had already reached out to her cousin again. Elena had agreed to testify, to speak openly about the conversations she had overheard. And the buyers she entertained that day would later confirm her arrogance when we confronted her in public. Clara thought she had the upper hand. She didn't realize she had just walked into the trap we were setting. The morning after the open house, Clara acted as if nothing unusual had happened. She moved through the kitchen in a silk robe, humming lightly, preparing her coffee as though she had not just ushered strangers through the home where my mother still slept. The dissonance between her behavior and the reality of what she was doing made the air heavy. I could not even meet her eyes. Julian came by later that day. His first words were blunt. The time for passive observation had ended. He believed Clara needed to be exposed publicly, in a way she could not deny or twist. Waiting longer would only give her room to maneuver. She had already demonstrated that shame did not slow her down. Over the next days, we began to plan. I collected the papers she had left behind, the real estate brochures, the preliminary contracts she had hidden, the correspondence that arrived addressed only to her. Julian, meanwhile, spoke with the neighbors who had overheard Clara boasting. They agreed to testify if needed. Even her cousin Elena, though nervous, confirmed she would come forward if it meant stopping Clara before the house slipped permanently away. The sense of urgency grew stronger when Julian discovered another scheduled showing. This time, it was not just curious buyers. There were official agents involved. If she secured a serious offer, it would take a lengthy court fight to reverse it. On the morning of that showing, Julian and I positioned ourselves quietly in the house. We stayed in the background as Clara welcomed two well-dressed couples. She led them through the rooms, pointing out features as though she were the rightful hostess. I stood rigid in the hallway, listening to her describe my mother's bedroom as a guest suite with potential. Hearing her reduce decades of family memory to marketing language burned inside me. When one of the couples asked about ownership, Clara spoke without hesitation. She claimed she had inherited the house through family arrangements, presenting herself as sole decision-maker. Her tone carried authority, but I noticed her eyes flicker when she realized I was standing within earshot. She tried to ignore me, continuing her pitch, but I knew the moment was approaching. When the couples left, Julian confronted her in the entryway. He didn't shout. He simply held up the folder of documents and asked her if she had told them the full truth. Clara narrowed her eyes, demanded to know what he meant, but her voice trembled faintly. It was the first sign of weakness we had seen. We invited Elena that evening, telling Clara it was simply a family discussion. She arrived quietly, her face pale, but once she sat down, the words spilled out. She described how Clara had confided in her weeks earlier, speaking openly about plans to sell the house and leave with someone else. She described overhearing conversations late at night, Clara whispering to a man on the phone, promising him that soon they would have enough money to start over. Clara did not deny it. Instead, she turned the accusation around, claiming Elena was jealous, that she was inventing stories out of spite. But the weight of evidence around her, contracts, brochures, overheard remarks, was too much to dismiss. For the first time, Clara's mask of control slipped visibly in front of everyone. The breaking point came 2 days later, when Julian and I arranged a meeting with one of the real estate agents Clara had courted. We explained the situation calmly, showing him the fragile state of our mother's health, explaining how Clara had acted without transparency. To our relief, he admitted that Clara had been aggressive, pushing to expedite the listing, downplaying the complications of ownership. He promised to step back until clarity was reached. That admission was crucial. Without eager agents, her path to selling narrowed. But Clara was not one to retreat easily. When she realized deals were slipping away, she grew sharper at home. She accused me of betrayal for involving outsiders. She framed herself as the victim, saying she had sacrificed everything for my family only to be turned against. Her tone was icy, her words measured, but there was venom underneath. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Julian received a message from a mutual acquaintance who had seen Clara at a restaurant, not with friends, but with a man in an intimate posture. They were leaning close, speaking in low voices, and when the bill came, she held his hand across the table. That detail matched what Elena had already confessed. Clara's future plans were not for us. They were for her and this hidden lover. Julian and I chose not to tell Margaret yet. Her health was too delicate, but we knew the truth had to surface soon. We decided on a public confrontation during Clara's next showing. If she wanted to present herself as owner and hostess, she would do so under the full light of witnesses. The day came swiftly. Clara wore her most formal dress, preparing to impress a new group of buyers. She welcomed them with polished charm, guiding them through the living room, gesturing to the view from the windows. Julian and I waited in silence until the right moment. When the buyers asked about the property's history, I stepped forward. I calmly explained that the house had belonged to our family for generations, that our mother still lived upstairs, and that Clara had acquired her signature during a period of illness and confusion. The buyers froze. Clara tried to protest, but Julian added his voice, producing the stack of papers she had hidden, along with statements from neighbors who had overheard her boasting. The room filled with tension. The buyers excused themselves quickly, unwilling to be involved in family conflict. Clara was left standing pale and furious, her authority stripped in front of strangers. That evening, Clara lashed out. She threatened legal action, claimed she would sue for defamation, and even suggested she would expose our dysfunctional family in court. But the strength of her words was fading. The agents no longer trusted her. Her cousin was willing to testify, and the community had already begun whispering about her behavior. Her final collapse began when her lover learned of the confrontation. He realized the property was not a quick asset, but a tangled mess. Witnesses later told us he had cut ties swiftly, unwilling to sink further into her schemes. Clara, once so confident, now stood alone. For me, the realization was painful yet clarifying. The woman I had intended to marry had not only deceived me, but nearly stolen the very foundation of my family's life. She had built her power on my mother's weakness, manipulated my trust, and tried to erase Julian's warnings. The mask was gone. All that remained was the cold ambition underneath. And now, finally, she was cornered. The public confrontation at the open house had left Clara reeling, but she didn't crumble immediately. She doubled down in the days that followed, determined to claw back the image of control she had once worn so easily. She told neighbors that we were bitter, jealous siblings who could not stand to see her succeed. She implied that my mother had preferred her company to ours, and that Margaret had chosen her as guardian of the house. The brazenness of the lie made my stomach churn. Yet the shift was visible. The real estate agents she had once courted stopped returning her calls. The glossy brochures no longer arrived at the door. Even those who had once admired her charm began avoiding her on the street. The whispers that circulated through the neighborhood were no longer about admiration for her elegance, but about her greed. Julian pressed me to act quickly. We gathered our evidence. The contracts, the brochures, Elena's testimony, the statements from neighbors who overheard her boasting. We filed to contest the ownership transfer on the grounds that our mother had been in a weakened state, unfit to understand the implications when Clara pushed the papers in front of her. The process would be long, but we had momentum. Clara responded with fury. She threatened countersuits, claimed we were slandering her reputation, and even accused us of financial mismanagement. Her words grew louder but emptier, like a storm that had already spent its strength. The weight of evidence piled against her, and her network of supporters thinned. The turning point came when Elena testified formally. She sat in a quiet office, nervous but steady, and recounted the conversations she had overheard. She told how Clara had laughed about securing the house, how she had whispered to her lover about selling quickly before anyone could intervene. She even described Clara's habit of coaching Margaret, softening her up before signing, making it seem like just another harmless formality. Hearing Elena's testimony recorded on paper felt like breathing clean air after weeks of smoke. It was no longer just our word against Clara's. At home, Clara's mask was completely gone. She packed her belongings into boxes, insisting she no longer cared about the wedding. She told me I would regret betraying her, that I had destroyed the only person willing to stand by me. But her words carried no weight. She was no longer a fiancée. She was an intruder squatting in my life. When my mother learned the truth, her disappointment was quiet but devastating. She asked me how she could have been so foolish, how she could have trusted someone who saw her illness as weakness to exploit. I told her gently it wasn't her fault. Clara had been patient, strategic, and relentless. Anyone would have believed her. The court battle stretched on for weeks, but the outcome became clearer with each passing day. Witnesses came forward. Agents confirmed Clara had pressed for a quick sale. Neighbors recalled her arrogance. She tried to paint herself as a caregiver unfairly attacked by ungrateful sons, but her words sounded hollow against the growing chorus of truth. Finally, the judgment came. The transfer was overturned, the house restored to my mother's name. Clara's claims were dismissed. She walked out of the courthouse pale and shaken, her former composure shattered. But karma didn't end there. News of the case spread through her social circles. Former friends withdrew. Employers hesitated. The lover she had once planned to run away with had already abandoned her, unwilling to tie himself to someone so toxic. By the end of that year, she was living in a small rented flat across town, her reputation reduced to a warning others whispered about. For us, the aftermath was not triumph but relief. My mother passed peacefully months later, knowing the house was safe, knowing her sons had defended the place that held the family's memory. Julian and I agreed to preserve it, not as property to be sold, but as a reminder of what nearly slipped away. I thought often of Clara in the months that followed, not with longing, but with a kind of grim clarity. She had gambled everything: love, family, reputation, for ownership she could not even secure. In the end, she lost all of it. As for me, I rebuilt slowly. I learned to look for loyalty not in grand gestures, but in small consistencies. When someone stands by you quietly, without demanding reward, that is real care. Clara had taught me that lesson through betrayal. Julian and I grew closer than we had ever been. The ordeal had forged a bond that could not be broken by schemes or lies. We kept the house together, renovating it, filling it with warmth again. It stood not as a monument to Clara's greed, but as proof that even the deepest deception could be undone. In the end, Clara had set out to strip us of everything, but it was she who was left empty. The collapse of her life was not quick, but total. And I realized that sometimes the harshest revenge is not delivered by force, but by truth dragging a lie into daylight until it dissolves completely. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.